We have a really great group of executives from different companies that will come to really address the emerging markets and the opportunities and challenges in those markets. We have Juan, Dada, who's global specialist with the Sustainable Business Advisory of the IFC, International Finance Corporation. We have Damien, who's a fellow at the Paulson Institute. Venky, Valluri, who's chairman and president of Ingersoll Rand, India. My good friend, Vipul Shah, who's president and CEO of Dow India. And the conversation's going to be led by Stefan, who's a director at McKinsey. So I will turn it over to Stefan.
Great. So I hope you all enjoyed your lunch. We're here to talk about what is the international dimension of sustainability. And I want to set up just a bit of context of why would you care about the international dimension. Some of this you may already be deeply involved in given the number of globally operating companies here. But I want to build a little bit on what Jonathan teed up this morning. He looked back over the last 50 years and showed you how much of an increase in consumption of different commodities and energy and water was there. If we flip that and say, let's look forward 20 years to 2030, you already heard from Doug how short of water we will be. 80% of the world's population will be in areas of water shortage before we really have significant effects of climate change on top of that. But if you look at any of the other commodities, it's between 50% and 150% on top of the historic growth that we actually need in terms of resources. Because of the 3 billion in middle class population joining the middle class, that's the amount of increase we're talking about. And most of that, about 2.5 of the 3 billion, is really in what we talk about as emerging markets, India, China, but also a lot of the other emerging markets around the world. So our problem gets much, much tougher when we think about sustainability, not just in the US, but on a global scale. Because we can't just shut the door and say, well, too late for you, right? Figure it out some other way. That, I think, is really the root of it. The other part of it, though, is the time scale. We industrialized, if you think about the UK, in 150 years. In the US, it was around 100 years, 120 years. If you look at some of the developed economies in East Asia, it was 25, 30 years. We are now talking about making this change. In the case of China, about 12 years. In the case of India, it'll be about 18 years or so. So we are talking about doing larger populations in a much faster pace. And that means that we really are running out of time, as I think Doug alluded to. We can't wait for governments to figure it out. It has to be business-led, and we have to make the changes already. So that's one dimension. But that's seeing the international part as the problem. I think there are other ways to look at how sustainability evolves internationally as well. For one, we've got great ideas and solutions actually already arising internationally, and I'm going to ask my panelists to talk about some of the things they're seeing in their respective geographies. If you look at Brazil and what has happened in biofuels, if you look at Japan and how Japan has been driving energy efficiency well before any of us really pushed it here in the US, both on the corporate side and buildings and government. Places like China, which while they may have not made as much progress on water yet, have actually made great progress in terms of grid build-out, adopting wind energy at a scale that really is unprecedented, just given their growth and ability to invest. So there is a source of innovation here. And what's very interesting, if you look at things like recycling and reuse, actually some of the emerging countries are better than we are in the US. I think somebody earlier today already alluded to the fact that you don't find a lot of plastic bottles in China, right, Jeff? I think you made that comment this morning. Because it's so valuable in that economy where people are living on a couple dollars a day that actually that's a valuable resource. And it tends to be as they get richer that we really have a garbage problem. And then we apply technology to recover from that. So even there's innovation in reuse and in how efficiently those supply chains work at the local level. And lastly, there's a big license to operate issue. As the joke goes, if it's between you and farmers cultivating food as a multinational corporation, you pretty much always lose if it comes down to the politics. And so as you go into emerging markets for operations, not just for a market, you have a lot of these challenges to figure out as well. I'd love to just, as each of you can perhaps open up, describe a little bit about the basis of your perspectives. and then particularly talk about what do you see as both the challenges and some of the opportunities in each of the geographies that you're working in today. Maybe we just start from that end.
You want me to go? Okay. Good afternoon. This is the first time I'm actually coming to this forum. So I thought I'd actually add a couple of perspectives over here, just from challenges and from opportunity standpoint. And I don't know how many of you have been to India. Okay, few of you. There's and I can go about, I represent Ingersoll Rand, I can go about the global stuff, what we do in terms of sustainability, et cetera. And like any other multinational, we do a lot of work globally. But as this discussion is more tuned towards emerging economies, I have a fundamental premise, those of you who have not been to India, to really look at that market. And I think the cost of social unrest in an emerging economy will always overshadow the intent of profitability. So if you're going to work in an emerging economy, and in this case India, if there is going to be a cost of social unrest, if your workers don't turn up, if the markets don't operate well, forget about shareholder value maximization or profitability. It becomes extremely difficult. I don't know how many of you have seen water wars. I think Doug, the earlier speaker, talk about water issues in India. I don't know how many of you have actually seen water wars. And that's a reality in those economies. So I think what happens to most multinationals is you tend to go up there with a core competency and you say, this is my product, this is my technology, and that's how I'm going to actually benefit in this market. But that doesn't work very effectively. So as far as Ingersoll Rand is concerned, what we did is we defined a strategy. We defined a strategy with saying that we're going to have a convergent strategy. And I've been listening to some of the talks early in the sessions about circular, recycling, material, etc. But you don't have the ability or the time to actually say that I'm going to reinvent, re-innovate everything for that market. So we defined something called as convergent strategy, which essentially meant that we're going to do three things. We're going to have business and technology convergence, we're going to have innovation convergence, and we're going to have something called as social convergence. So when I talk about business and technology convergence, we took a few examples of where we were good at and how we really need to actually liaise with other companies to create a market. Now let me give you an example. Food security is a big issue, and a number of you have talked about. But if we really look at countries like India, and I've heard about the food wastage, which goes from 30% to 40% across the world. In India, it's equally a big problem. So we said, okay, if food security is an issue, and we are the refrigeration experts, we need to actually take a technology to the farmer right at the end to ensure that the food that he produces, which comes to the consumer, in that whole supply chain, how do we reduce actually the wastage? So we designed a certain product. We went to an automotive company, and we said, why don't you actually slap this product on your automotive vehicle and actually take it to the end farmer so that we can actually collect produce and bring it back. What we did not realize was you can't run a 40-foot container on Indian roads. It's just not possible. We realized that these farms were so small and the roads were so small that you really needed a technology where you needed to have a smaller platform which actually went to the farmer. So we actually worked with a large automotive manufacturing company. We put the refrigeration unit on a small truck, which can actually maneuver on small roads. We went up to the farmer, and the farmer said, listen, we're not going to pay for the fuel. It doesn't make sense, because once you have a refrigeration unit, it consumes more fuel, so we're not going to pay for the fuel. You got to have a technology which does not consume fuel. So we went back to the drawing board stage, we put a battery in it, and we ran the refrigeration unit on a battery. So now this was innovation for an emerging economy which had to have multiple organizations. We were not good at automotive technology, we were good at something else. We packaged this together and we went to the farmer. And then we realized that it's probably good for us to actually work with an IT company to team up with and actually ensure that we're able to track the vehicle when it's coming from the farm to the folk or to the end user. So now you had true convergence happening across the whole chain. A small truck, refrigeration unit, preventing food loss, tracking the vehicle. Now that was a unique innovation for us, and this really kind of brought in convergence. We looked at energy management for large buildings. And we looked at India, which is kind of power starved, which runs in most of the buildings over there, you will realize it actually runs on captive power where you're running a generator in the whole building. So we actually worked with IBM and we said, listen, Mr. IBM, you guys have been good at tracking telecom towers in the country. Why don't we actually mix and match our technologies? We will control the chillers in a large building and you guys will pick up the data and give it to us. Again, there was convergence. So really the idea which I was trying to kind of tell all of you is in emerging economies, if you think that you will start innovating technologies or innovating business solutions completely ab initio, I think it's a big waste of time. You got to converge, you got to collaborate, you got to get together and then actually create markets. So just to share these two examples, the way we've been working in emerging economies, whether it's food security, whether it's energy management, we are actually beginning to do some of this work over there and it's actually paying off to some of the to at least our organization, the way we have actually put this plan.
Thank you, Venky. Vipul, do you want to go?
Thank you. I guess it's India to India. And I think, thank you, Venky, for covering various macro issues in India, which I totally agree. And part of our strategy in India, I mean, Dow today is about $1 billion revenue in the country with 1,000+ employees, 4 manufacturing locations. And I had the opportunity to see the operation grow. 1992, when I became country head for the first time, this is my 3rd stint back into the country, it was 10 million, 10 people. And so I think you seeing this operation grow is part of it is because sustainability has been the core part of our strategy. And if you look at now in today's world, and to Venky's point, exactly the same, our theme of the strategy has been innovation in India for India. And we are not innovating core research activities, but we are looking at is an application innovation. The Rolls Royces of Dow is not going to work in India when you require these small Tata Nanos or Maruti Suzukis. But at the same time, the way I look at the platform of a company like Dow is like chassis of a car. When you're putting a chassis on the assembly line of an automobile industry, what you put on that chassis will make different vehicle. And that's what we've been focusing on. Getting our people to understand the market, have the people who understands the Dow technology, and have that marry across. And I think that is probably our biggest advantage of looking at it. Like look at our packaging industry development. I actually 25 years back in India got hired as packaging industry expert at Dow. We were looking at edible oil packing in India. Now how does that help with the sustainability? If you look at edible oil packing, how it was bought, loose, adulteration, pilferage, health issues, which comes because of all that, becomes an intent. Packing it in a tin container is highly energy intensive product, which is a 16-liter tin which you buy, and now you get it into 1 kg. But we were looking at of loose 1 liter, half a liter bags. And we actually designed those packaging. Completely different. Nowhere else in the Dow system in the world we were doing this. But that example, the knowledge came from Dow. How to do a barrier film, how to make a packing of a film which will have the oxygen and the moisture protection for the product inside the bag. And I think that is something which is what we do in the country, and that's what we advise people to do. Nowhere else in the world you would think about doing those things, but you do that in a country like India. Sustainability is both environmental and social issues in the country, which Venky touched on it. And I think if you miss that part of it, it's not going to get. Most multinationals understand this. Most large Indian corporates do understand because they are going global, whether it's the Birlas or the Tatas, they go global, so they do understand this and do practice. But the large part of the country is small, medium-scale industry, or the farmers, which are small-scale farmers. You don't have large-scale farmers. And how do you educate them? One of the other initiatives we've done to educate people on sustainability is we actually partnered with an NGO group in the country for the last 4 years, and we are now in the process of scaling up. What we have designed is an online as well as in-class training program for teachers to educate on basic principles of preservation and sustainability. The whole idea was you teach one teacher, you can reach 400 students. Catch them young, bring the younger population with that mindset that, simple thing, how many of us, and I'm guilty, I'll say up front, that, when you shave in the morning, the guys here, sorry, not the girls. In the morning, you keep the tap on while you're shaving. And I think that's a simple thing, how much water you lose. Yes, I mean, that's not the water which we look at it. We talk about irrigations and stuff. Giant irrigation in India actually has been doing micro irrigation, drip irrigation for 2 decades now. We've been partnering with that. Dow doesn't play directly into that market, but helping, enabling them, making polyethylene resin, which will have 30% faster speed line for them to use their capital much more efficiently. And Giant does end-to-end. But that conversion takes a long time, and I think that's what we need to understand, that playing in an emerging market, you need to be ready to put extra efforts, as well as localize the solutions and touch the local people. Otherwise, you will have social unrest. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Juan, do you want to take us to other parts of the world?
I will, but I will build on what it was said, because it is similar. Emerging markets is a pretty broad term, and most of the ones with the biggest global relevance are the Indias and the Brazils and the ones that we all know. But in general terms, there's always a specific relevance and specific products coming for certain geographies. So emerging markets are going to become a global relevant arena for the business and the community at large. Question that then we face is how to do it in a proper way, how to help them and how to get together with them in the process of transformation. The point that I'm going to be making is that sustainability for most of these companies, large and small, in emerging markets is not anymore just an aspiration. It's becoming a reality. It's becoming material. It's becoming part of the business case. And the way to solve it, the way that we can partner with that, is around information, around knowledge, whether it's around education, around building capacity, or it's just around innovation and really business drive. If we move away from the idea that we want to do good to environment, or we want to build on sustainability for the brand, for the license to operate, we'll find actually a lot of business opportunities and a lot of markets to be exploited there. I think 2 great examples in India we heard, and that's the case in any other geography in that sense. The challenge is to get to those hurdles of information or knowledge. One of the things that I think is changing faster in that sense then is the partnerships and the alliance between companies that are not even talking to each other, not competitors, not even allies in a market, but could together open the barrier or go into a different niche market or different product in that sense. The measurement, the information is also changing. We're starting to have the capacity to get real-time data, to get remote sensing, to get all these applications of technology for the information of what is a business opportunity, but also a sustainability, or let's just say environment and social issue. And putting those things together then is what is allowing for companies to speak the language of communities, the language of governments, for them to partner with each other and start looking into those things. I think this speaks a little bit about what we see in the global context, and even the notion of shadow pricing and the notion of putting their own matrix and having companies and corporations or even partnerships then come up with a price. I thought only markets would come up with prices. But now we have the technology, we have the capacity to really take the measurements, to really go to the farm and to the small farms and start taking the view or the integrated view that allows for an analysis that was beyond or is beyond what traditionally was considered just the business plan or the business application. That is the emerging markets that I want to portray. The one that if you're not that creative, if you're not that open, you're not really going to be doing business there.
Thank you. And Damien, last but certainly not least, let's talk about China, the big gorilla.
That's right, 900-pound gorilla always, right? Well, thank you, Stefan, and thanks to CEF for inviting me here. I don't work for a company. I'm a China specialist working for a nonprofit institute set up by former Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson, focused on U.S.-China. My background is specifically on Chinese energy, climate change, sustainability. In my previous incarnation, I actually used to advise many of the companies in this room on China, both on the energy side and sustainability side. So I don't know how many people here have personal experience or business operations in China, so I'm going to try to keep my comments both sort of 30,000 feet, but also marry it to sort of more sectorally specific areas where there are opportunities. I think in terms of 30,000 feet view, I think the person that still got it right, that was probably the most prescient, wasn't a Chinese person or an American, was actually a French guy. His name is Napoleon. He said about 200 years ago that let her sleep, for when China wakes, she will shake the world. I still think 200 years later, that's right. If you just look at what China has done since 1995 to about now, in 1995, China's GDP was under $1 trillion. It is now $8.3 trillion. China in from 2010 to 2011, in one single year, it added a GDP equivalent to Canada's. That's the pace you need to think about when it comes to China. Now, obviously, we all know that China is slowing down from its 10% plus growth, but 6 or 7% is still by far the best emerging market performance in the world. Now, that's one way to look at China, right? China is the biggest energy consumer, the biggest carbon emitter by far. Even though they dispute the data, they still say the United States is the biggest energy consumer. But the other way to look at China is what I think Doug put it really well, which is from the angle of scarcity. The default setting of China has always been about scarcity. It was given not enough of anything to support this kind of growth. It's 8% of arable land, global arable land, supporting about 22% of global population. The math there just doesn't add up. It's got about one third of global average in terms of per capita water, so that again doesn't quite add up. Now, a lot of what China's doing happens to be energy intensive and water intensive. They are, as Stephen said, going through industrialization in about one generation, and so that's had dramatic costs on the environment. And in fact, that is going to stall future growth going forward, and the Chinese government realizes that. And it is the critical challenge of China going forward. It's not just about at the government level, the public notices. I was just in Beijing 2 weeks ago, didn't see the sun for 7 days, perpetual haze. It's gotten worse since the Olympics. So these are sort of, bread and butter issues. They're public concerns. And I think, China, unfortunately, like the United States, cannot simply just do renewables, because that's just going to be insufficient for China. It has to really do what we do here in the United States, which is most of the above strategy on the energy side. Everything except for coal, basically. A 70% coal economy, they have to reduce that down to more reasonable levels, perhaps around 50%, but that's going to take another 20 years at least. So, yes, they're ramping up renewables, they're ramping up wind, solar. It's by far the fastest growing market in the world right now in terms of install capacity. But when you look at their targets, by 2015, they will still only have 11.4% coming from non-fossil fuels. So the flip side of that, that's 90% still coming from fossil fuels. 70% of that is going to be coal still, roughly. So for China, really the key in the near term, the opportunities is how to get off a coal-based economy faster than they are doing right now. And I think there are some opportunities in natural gas. I think China, like the United States, views it as sort of a bridge fuel to the future. Hopefully it's not a destination fuel, but a bridge fuel to the future. I think they want to double natural gas consumption. Like the United States, they think they have a lot of shale gas, which they do. But again, this comes back to the water scarcity issue. There's only so much water that can be used for fracking shale gas. And the other thing that hasn't really been mentioned, that most of China's shale reserves are actually in Sichuan, which is extremely earthquake prone. And as we know, there's a potential correlation between seismic activity and fracking. So you don't want to have earthquakes in Sichuan, which is already a huge political issue. So China has these monumental challenges over the next decade, I think. But there's plenty of opportunities. I think one of the biggest opportunities for China is that it's not necessarily very good at the leading edge of innovation, right? It's clear. But it's extremely good at digesting existing innovation. And it's very open to being sort of the experimental ground for a lot of the new technologies. And it can commercialize, I think, faster than we can in the United States. As we can see with things like solar and wind, they've driven down prices significantly. China price used to be about the cost of labor. China price also similarly applies to the cost of manufactured goods like solar and wind. They can drive it down much faster. And now we have some trade issues with China over that, but the reality is that they can do that. And so I think, think about China as sort of a interesting, pilot program for a lot of the leading technologies that I think the Chinese are willing to do, because again, the state plays a much bigger role in the economy, so they can fund it, subsidize it. Things like carbon capture sequestration, EVs and so on, all those things. There are some challenges there, but I think they're willing to try. And the government is willing to back it up with a lot of funds. And they certainly have plenty of money to spend, the least of which is $3.3 trillion in foreign exchange reserves. So I think, we need to be very sober about the challenges. They've gotten worse. But I think, it's not that the Chinese government are not doing anything. They're actually doing quite a bit. But it is also a paradox that even though they're doing a lot more than people think they are, they're also not doing enough. So we need to recognize both sides of the equation, and I think really identify specific opportunities that align with what the Chinese are trying to do right now, which is meaningfully rebalance their economy from a capital-intensive industrialization phase to a more consumption-driven phase. And that should potentially be good for a lot of what you guys are trying to do here environmentally on the sustainability side. The only challenge now, and I'll end with this point, is how do you deal with Chinese urbanization, which the government has now identified as the biggest growth driver for the next 20 years. Their goal is staggering. They want to put 100 million people into cities over the next 10 years. So that's 10 million a year. That's equal to creating a New York-sized city every single year for 10 years.
3 Chicagos.
3 Chicagos. So think about the demand on energy, water. Every new apartment building with new flush toilets, new washing machines, all those things will drive energy and water consumption. So this has become, and it's the focus of our institute, is how do you help the Chinese get urbanization right on the energy and water front? Because if you don't, to be frank, a lot of the other stuff just doesn't really matter, because that is central to how China will grow over the next 10 to 20 years. And I'll end right there.
Thank you. So we've heard a lot around the resource challenges, the social unrest, and some of the risk to license to operate. And I think, Damien, you teed up also that some of these countries on a per capita basis, just given the size of the populations, are facing an even more acute resource challenge. Some of it maybe because of underpricing, some of it intrinsic. For a multinational, as many of the companies here in this room, how do you actually capture some of these opportunities in emerging markets? How do you get the financing? How do you convince the rest of the company to invest in what is typically seen as a riskier opportunity or a riskier geography? Share a little bit about your experience. How do you really go after sustainability? And then, of course, managing the local context and government that you have already teed up.
Biggest challenge is to convince Dougs of the world, with the CEO at the corporate headquarters and the whole team. Sometimes you get the CEO aligned, but the team underneath who's getting the implementation side, I think that's where you lose the stuff. And I think what I liked about what Doug was talking about, really putting metrics around what you want to measure. And unless I think you get that right, that is probably the biggest hurdle. Implementing in India, leave it to us who know the situation on ground, and we can do it. What you want to do, decide, and then go ahead and don't change minds halfway through the process. That's what I would advise. Getting financing, I think emerging countries, for the right business model, there's plenty of money available. I think people know how to manage the local risk, social unrest, or otherwise, or the environmental related license to operate. All those issues are very, very manageable in that context, in my view.
I would stress the fact that you're saying emerging markets as if it was one target.
It's international, actually, so not even all just emerging.
You gotta get the local knowledge. Yeah. You gotta be able to figure out the differences.
Well, I think in China, it's a little bit somewhat opposite to what you said, which is that I think at the center, they believe they have fairly stable, clear policies that set the broad trajectory. And one thing you consistently hear in China is that the provincial and lower levels, they just don't tend to follow them very much. The mountains are far away, the emperor is far away. So in Guangdong, they don't necessarily follow what Beijing says, but Guangdong is also an example where it's more progressive on many fronts than Beijing is. Guangdong to me has always been sort of the California of China. It's, and it's the size of Germany. It's doing all kinds of interesting things. It just started its own carbon trading scheme. So I think looking at what Guangdong does, similar to what California may do in this country, I think that's an interesting parallel in terms of how it could lead. But again, not everyone believes in what Guangdong is doing. So I think in China, you really need to figure out specific particularities of the local regions and how to work with local mayors, and also really change local politicians' incentives. Because in China, very few things are non-political. They're always political because of the state's role in the economy. So the way that local politicians are judged for promotion is two things: GDP, and can you keep mass unrest to a minimum? That makes up about 85% of their sort of annual evaluation. So if you don't change those local incentives, it doesn't really matter what Beijing says. They can have all the best policies in the world, and they do, but it doesn't necessarily incentivize the local level to really support the architecture of the policy. So there's a lot of things they need to do on a local level to change incentives in the absence of a rule of law, because they're not really building a rule of law regime. So you got to be able to think about how to change politicians' incentives.
Okay. So I'm probably going to add a couple of statements here. Is if any one of you believe that the regulation in emerging economies will drive your market, that may be really partially true. But if innovation will drive your market expansion, that's absolutely true. If you're able to actually innovate for that market based on a platform technology which you have globally, and you're able to get the value price equation right, then you really kind of get onto a major growth curve. We recently tried an experiment of building what I would call as an entrepreneur creation program within the organization. So what we did is we actually hired a few people from the premier institutes, and education at the premier institutes is pretty good in India, especially the IITs and the IIMs, which you folks would have heard about. And we said, okay, you guys come, join us, but at the end of 2 years, you leave the company. But what we will do is we'll train you as entrepreneurs. And in these 2 years, we will actually drive technologies which will drive sustainability, technologies that will drive appropriate price points for tier 2 and tier 3 markets. And we actually had about 15 people. And we actually put them in a 2-year training program with a clear understanding that at the end of 2 years, you guys will leave the company. So we're going to take the risk. We're going to put the money up front. We're going to train you. But at the end of 2 years, you guys will actually operate from tier 2 and tier 3 markets, build sustainable solutions, and actually have access to our engineering centers. We got almost about 1,000 engineers, PhDs and the types working in our engineering centers. And we said you have open access to our engineering centers. So you go create markets, use our technology centers, but really create sustainable solutions. And I think that experiment has really proved very beneficial for us, because now what we're beginning to create, we do believe that we can actually globalize that. So I think for some of you who actually intend working in these markets, you really have to have an out-of-the-box thinking of how you want to crack those markets. You don't need to really create core technologies. Use the platform technologies globally what you have, build application technologies as what was said before, but really meant for that market. And then what happens is you're able to influence regulation, you're able to influence a number of things with the government, and then you see really a hockey stick growth coming up. And I think that's the way you really want to look at emerging economies, because you really can't plonk a product which is in the Western world and say, okay, now let me go and actually sell it in India, or sell it in China, or sell it anywhere else. It just doesn't work. So, just a thought.
So it's interesting to hear you describe, local opportunities, local knowledge, local products. You talk about, Damien, the knowing how the local government works and is incented. When we look globally at the resource opportunities, that huge gap that we talked about at the beginning, about 2/3 of it can be closed economically at corporate costs of capital. Interestingly, about 3/4 of it sits in emerging markets. Mm-hmm. So really, for all of you, the vast majority of the opportunity is in emerging markets, right? Whether it's in solutions grown there or in solutions adapted and transported there.
55% of our growth over the last 3 years came from India, China, Brazil. 3 countries of Ingersoll Rand's 55% of the growth came from these 3 countries. And sometimes you'll realize that it's very, very difficult to go through the bureaucratic system and large multinationals to say we need investment. But when you really look at the numbers, they just stack up. They're staggering. So that's something which I think folks need to realize.
So that tees up with the question I was going to ask each of you, which is, how do you identify the right ones that deserve the kind of global attention and scale, right? Not things that you can do locally. And how do you then build the case and the alignment? Any tips or pointers or advice? Do you want to start, Venky?
I think you need to have a seat on the table, number one. You don't have a seat on the table at the executive level, your voice actually will not be heard. If you're going to have an organization which is buried somewhere, reports into Asia Pacific, reporting into Europe, reporting into the US, I think that's a non-starter. All right, I can tell you that right now. So if you guys have got a leader in the emerging economies, ensure that he's part of your executive leadership team, sitting with the CEO and telling what really the facts are and how it's working. And then I think it actually trickles down to say what investments are required to actually try those innovations. I think that's the number one requirement, in my opinion. If it's really kind of had benefits for us in India, that's the way we worked.
Yeah, I think you've touched it. I think the other point I would raise it is that if you're not going to get the seat at the table, make sure the person on ground has enough credibility for the people who are sitting on the table. And I think that's how, at Dow, that's what we sort of keep. This is my 3rd time going back to India. Every time something happens, they keep sending me back to jumpstart the growth. And I say, I'm getting old. I know it's probably not going to happen too many times. But I think that's the credibility part. We're Dow Chemical. We are typical Midwest, family-oriented culture in our company. And so I think having that credibility at the corporate headquarters makes a huge difference. Who is saying what? In fact, one of the things I've said it for 20 years to my talent, which I'm bringing it up in my leadership, is that they ask me, what is your key job responsibility number 1? And I would say English to English translation. Because the way Midland speaks English is not how Indians will understand. And I can guarantee you how we speak in India, Midland's not going to understand. I think having that conduit, if you're not going to have the seat at the table, is very critical.
If you want to
I
comment?
think your question and the answers are from the perspective of developing a market and going into a market. So let me flip it around in terms of buying from or producing in emerging markets. I think it's exactly the same answer. Be a partner, engage locally. Don't think that you can just buy remotely or not in this new world where information flows, where everyone wants to know where things come from, where we could almost say where anything comes from right now. I think if you're flipping it around, if you're producing, purchasing from, also engage. Engage and involvement is the key.
One of the themes of the Corporate Ecoforum is actually for companies to team up on topics of interest. Can you describe a little bit, what are the opportunities there in emerging markets?
In fact, now I think there's a lot more understanding of India across the globe. But if I look at my second stint, which was 2004 to 2007, most American multinational CEOs in the country, we used to meet up. Not to talk about price fixing and all that. We put that caveat on the table once a month and checking notes and what's working, what's not working. Because a lot of corporate requirements were similar, or corporate hurdles were similar. So what worked for you? And so you learn from each other and create a support group. When you have a senior executive coming down to the country, have that support group also talk to them. And that has kind of helped over the early years. Today, I think things are quite different. I don't think you need to really talk about selling India to the corporate. I think, if you look at the younger generation in India, and that's quite a revealing, when I went back about a year and a half back, the shift which has happened is no longer asking, it's going to sound like John F. Kennedy, but it's asking about how are you going to sell India to the company? or what are you going to do for the company in terms of India understanding versus what's your company going to do for me in the country. And that shift has already happened. I think China, that shift happened probably 10 years back. But I'm seeing that in India, that shift is coming in most corporations today.
Damien, do you want to talk about collaboration? in
Sure.
China?
I mean, for the China market specifically, I think there's just, at this point, there's no way to get around working with state-owned enterprises. Whether you like them or not, they're such a dominant part of a lot of sectors. You can certainly work with private sector companies, but they're less powerful, less flush with financing, and oftentimes it's harder to partner with them. So, partnering with SOEs come with their own set of risks. Right now, I think one of the biggest problems that Western multinationals deal with is that the state companies are requiring technology transfer for market access. If you want to stay and expand in China, you better give them some technology. So I think protecting your core technology is a very important part. And that gets caught up in the broader issue right now of cybersecurity. That's center of why this is a big problem. And the other part about China too is that if you're a Japanese company or really some other companies, beware of Chinese nationalism. That is growing across the board, I think. I was there last September when the island issue was peaking, and it was quite nasty on the streets. There were a lot of protests and boycott of Japanese products. So I think Chinese nationalism is something that is growing in different ways. It's not really, it's not an anti-American nationalism, but I think it does surface and it does hurt companies operating in China. And so that's just a risk that I think companies ought to be aware of. And the way that the Chinese media and so on works is that when something does go wrong, it's often easier to find a scapegoat in a foreign multinational than it is a domestic Chinese company. So there's not equal risk sharing there in terms of who to blame. You see that all the time in how their state media works. So I think, and I've known many multinationals who've been burned, even though they haven't really done anything that's out of the ordinary, but they get burned over the domestic companies for obvious reasons. So things like that really need to be aware of, but at this point, China is just really not going to reform the state sector as much as people think they would. And so that's just a reality that I think companies have to deal with.
Thank you. Well, this has been a fascinating discussion. I think we heard unequivocally the importance of the international dimension. We heard that social unrest and the social dimension and license to operate becomes even more important than in developed, mature economies. That there clearly is an important dimension of local knowledge and local initiative, both for the operational side as well as for the market side. And that having a seat at the table, even if it's a rotating one where you go back and forth, or a very good channel of trust, is an essential ingredient for capturing this. So thank you to each of our panelists. And Amara, I think, will tell us where to go next.